Welcome back to Hey Kentucky. Now happy to be joined by a friend of the show, Congressman John Yarmuth. Congressman, you're the one person I know that when we call will come on and not fight with us like other congressmen, so we appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's great to be with you. I always think that anytime you get free media, it's good.
Well, there you go. Let's talk for just a second about what's been going on in Washington. I'm going to be honest, from a personal standpoint, regardless of how people feel about Kavanaugh and all that, I am more depressed about what I see in Washington in terms of the anger, the vitriol, and the seeming like whatever we can do to derail the other side. I feel it. It feels like it gets worse every day. Do you agree?
Well, living in it, I know that it's not that way, but I also know that it appears that way. And that's one of the frustrating things that I always say is, we all get along personally. There really isn't much hostility or animosity. We all know we're playing political theater. And that's what, to a certain extent, that's what went on in those confirmation hearings. And you saw how the outside world just totally embraced that whole conflict, and it was wall to wall.
But doesn't that hurt the country? In some ways, that almost makes it worse to me. That it's everybody gets along, they play this theater, and then out in the real world, it has implications that almost are worse. It almost makes me even more upset.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. And when the Republican baseball practice was shot up a year ago, Rand Paul was in the field, was dodging bullets, and I talked to him afterwards, and we said, we really need to do what we can to make sure people who understand it, it's not personal. You don't need to hate somebody to disagree with them. And obviously this guy, the one who did the shooting, was crazy, and that's the way he bought into this hate and tried to act on it. So, yeah, it's dangerous.
It really is.
It is dangerous.
We're in an election season, and we see a lot of back and forth. You are running for re-election. How do you feel that's going, and is this an environment in this district where you think it's good for Democrats or yourself?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a very difficult year to unseat a Democratic incumbent. And I think out of the 69 battleground districts, there are only 6 that are held by Democrats this year. Those are races that are competitive. So, I feel good about my race. I feel good about Democrats in general. My opponent is probably the strongest opponent I've had, at least on paper, for several election cycles now. So we're taking the campaign seriously. But I feel pretty optimistic that we're going to have a good year.
Do you? I've been looking at the race for the House overall, and it seems positive for the Democrats. But there's also a level of people like myself look at the polls and say, well, 2016, they weren't right. So when I see all these polls, do you feel that polling is more correct now, or is there any still worry that like in 2016, we're not measuring something?
The polling is good as long as you can predict who's coming out to vote.
Okay.
And that's what pollsters are having a real hard time in judging this year. My friend Mike Capuano, a Democrat from Massachusetts, lost his primary race. He was polling 13 points ahead 2 weeks before the election and lost by 17 points.
Wow.
Why? Because there were a lot of voters who were not being polled. I know that in a poll in the 6th district race that the New York Times was doing, when they polled millennials, 1 out of every 670 they called actually answered the phone.
And I think they only polled 2 or something total. Yeah.
Exactly. So you were seeing that. We saw that happen in the Florida gubernatorial primary, the Democratic primary, when Andrew Gillum won. 25% of his voters were first-time voters.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this year, any Democratic candidate who's within the margin of error is probably going to win, because I think there's this great young unpolled population out there.
And I would think that's a problem going forward with polling. Young people, I mean, they ain't answering the phone. I'm not even that young, and I'm not answering the phone if I don't know the number. Right. Like, I think it would be very difficult to poll people 40 and under, right?
It absolutely is. And pollsters are trying to figure it out, but they can't. They try to get as many as they can and then weight them, but that's pretty risky. And, there was a poll 2 weeks ago NBC did that said 55% of millennials would probably or definitely vote. Well, only 20% of millennials voted in 2016.
So it'll be interesting to see
So
if
if
that
you
happens.
get anywhere near 55%, it's going to be a total wipeout for Democrats because millennials will vote for Democrats by a large margin.
And that's why you're confident. Let's switch gears just a second to the race where we're based in Lexington between Amy McGrath and Andy Barr. Going to your point, I've seen polls from both parties. I've seen some with Barr up 5 or 6. I've seen some with McGrath up 10. I don't think people totally know. What's your read on the race?
I think Amy McGrath has a huge enthusiasm factor, and I also think she has a really good ground game. She's opened offices in all 19 counties in her district, which I don't think anybody's ever come close to. And every time she opens an office, she has a great group of volunteers there. So I just have to believe that if the polls are relatively close, which I think they are, that she'll end up being victorious.
The viewers that watch this show in Lexington at least know what I'm saying. We are bombarded by advertisements from across the country. You turn on this show, I bet you when we go to break, it will be all McGrath and Barr. Do you think there comes a point where people just don't want to hear any more about it? And like, what as a candidate do you do?
I don't think there's any question about that. As I always say, people don't like the ads, they don't watch the ads, and they don't believe the ads. Other than that, it's a perfect strategy.
But to some extent they work, though, because, McGrath had a 12 to 13 point lead. Barr ran about a month of really negative ads, and the race tightened. I mean, people say they don't like them, but aren't they effective?
Well, they are effective with a small percentage of the audience. Now, in a close race, 4 or 5% movement makes a difference. In a race where you have a 10, 15 point margin, it's all wasted money as far as I'm concerned.
Let me ask you a little bit about Kentucky politics. There's a governor's race next year, and I expect a crowded Democratic primary, but so far only one candidate, Andy Beshear, has announced. We have Attica Scott talking about running, Adam Edlin, Allison Grimes, Rocky Atkins. Do you expect a competitive primary?
I think there will be a competitive primary. I don't know how many. I would say there'll be at least 3 candidates in the primary, and they'll all have a good stake to claim the nomination. I think that'll be healthy for Democrats next year.
Andy Beshear has raised something like $700,000, and we did a story in the last segment that some state Democrats are criticizing and saying you're taking money away from congressional races, from state House, state Senate races. Do you think the Attorney General should have spent his time raising for others instead of himself?
Well, I don't know how you run for governor. I don't know how you run for any statewide office today unless you're out raising money a year ahead of time. And so I don't blame him for doing it. I actually think the other candidates, potential candidates, if they're serious, should have been out there doing it as well. Look, I've got Amy McGrath raising tons of money out of this district right now.
She's raising a lot.
She's raising everywhere, $3 million in the last quarter. It's pretty astounding. And I have a candidate from California who's in town today raising money for his campaign in my congressional district.
Yeah.
So that's the way, fortunately or unfortunately, that's the way the game is right now. And I really don't blame Andy for doing that.
Final question. Throughout the Kavanaugh process, Mitch McConnell, senator, has been at the forefront. He's been taking a victory lap around after the confirmation. He comes up in 2020, and there's a lot of talk. Today, a new Morning Consult poll had him as still the least popular senator in his state in America. Is Mitch McConnell beatable in Kentucky, and do you think the Democrats will find a candidate who can beat him?
I think he's beatable. We haven't found a candidate yet. Everyone who's run against him in recent years has slipped up in a very significant way. Allison Grimes the last time by not saying she voted for Obama. He's gotten a lot of breaks, but I think he's clearly beatable. His approval rating is 30% or less statewide. Almost twice as many disapprove of him. I don't think he acquitted himself very well in this thing, even though he got his way. I don't think women in Kentucky or anywhere else are going to be particularly happy with him. So I think he's vulnerable, but again, you can't beat something with nothing.
In the state of Kentucky, he can be beaten, you think?
I think so.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, we'll see what happens. Congressman Yarmuth, thank you very much.
Matt.
Good luck with your election.